Welcome to the Life Self-Mastery Podcast, where we bring in entrepreneurs who have created online businesses and improved their lifestyles. Here's your host, Rohit Malhotra.
Hi everyone, this is Rohit from Life Self-Mastery, and today I'm excited to have Rhiannon Beaubien, who is the Managing Director of Farnam Street blog, as well as the primary author of the Great Mental Model book series. Rhiannon lives in Ottawa with her husband and two boys. She loves writing fiction, a good glass of wine, and circus aerials on the high trapeze. Rhiannon has done a bachelor's in philosophy and drama for Queen's University. Welcome to the show, Rhiannon.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Awesome. So, I was searching about what you've done, and it looks like you work for Canadian intelligence agency. So, how did you get to work for the intelligence agency?
Yeah. So, that's an interesting story. Many years ago, when I was doing a master's in international communications, I thought that I went over to England to do it. And then I thought I'd go home to Toronto and work in public relations, which seemed to be what a lot of people did with a communications degree. And while I was there, I took one course on propaganda and psychological operations. And it's like this world opened up to me that communications are everywhere. Everybody does them. And so in that moment, I decided that I was going to do a very different sort of communications. And I researched different agencies and organizations in Canada that do communications for military or intelligence purposes. And I applied and I got in.
Very nice. And how long were you working in the agency, and what kind of roles were you doing there?
I worked there for just over 10 years. I always worked in operations. So intelligence operations are usually divided roughly into two groups. You have your defensive operations and your offensive operations. I did time in both, but primarily defense, which was because we're in the internet age, which was involved protecting the systems of importance to the government of Canada.
Got it. And of 10 years into agency, and how did you get into Farnam Street?
Well, so Shane and I, Farnam Street's founder, Shane Parrish, we worked at the same agency and we worked on a lot of operations together. And we started a friendship. I mean, we were friends first, and we were both interested in similar topics. We were facing similar challenges at work. And we used to get together for lunch about once a month to talk through it and learn from each other and each other's experiences. And then when he decided to really devote himself and pursue developing Farnam Street, I was also ready for a change. So he took a chance on me, and here I am now.
Interesting. I also realized that there are others from the intelligence agency who are also part of the Farnam Street.
Let me think about that. No.
Oh,
no.
Okay.
No, nobody directly. I mean, there's our CEO, Alex Duncan, right. He worked for the Canadian military and he was in the special forces. Oh, okay. So a related field for sure, but not directly from the same place that Shane and I were.
Oh, okay, correct. And, from intelligence agency into writing, so how did you get your interest in writing?
So my interest in writing goes back for as long as I can remember. To be completely honest with you, I have been interested in telling stories since the beginning of me. And writing just seemed like the best, most interesting way to communicate those stories. I would often read books and get unsatisfied with the characters or the plot or the ending, and then decided, you know what, I needed to do this for myself. So writing was a hobby for many, many years, and it served as the backdrop for a lot of what I did. And then in my job specifically, when I worked at the intelligence agency, believe it or not, there is a lot of writing. I had jobs that were in policy and communications that involved crafting specific documents and types of work targeted to specific audiences. And although maybe not creative in the traditional sense, the writing I did there taught me a lot about accuracy and precision and how to be very effective with communications.
Got it.
So I was just going to say it worked out well that I was been practicing in various ways, looking at various forms and types of writing over the years. And then when I started at Farnam, I dived right into it and have significantly grown.
Interesting. I've been writing for quite a while, but it's just that I started a podcast 2 years back, and some of the podcasts are done better than the blog. So do you have any advice for me on how to write better, or even for bloggers who would want to get more impact, because there's a lot of content outside, and I thought podcast would be a different way to differentiate myself. So any advice for me on how to write better?
The best advice I can give you is find somebody to give you educated, critical feedback. That is one of the main reasons that I've seen my writing progress. Well, at Farnam Street, all of our pieces we have edited, and I've learned so much from that editor in terms of sentence structure, organization, grammar, what grabs people, how words flow. So that is a sort of an easier thing to do. If you can find somebody to give you some outside feedback, that could really help.
Interesting. I'm thinking about getting an editor myself. Yeah. So how does Farnam Street decide on what blog post to publish? You've been very careful about the kind of content which goes onto your blog, as well as when it comes to podcasts. Are we careful about the sort of content and the kind of blog posts which can publish? So how do you decide on what blog post needs to be published out so that there's only high quality content which is being published?
One of the things we take really seriously at Farnam Street is that so many people in the world are facing a time crunch. We all have more things that we want to do and that we can do than the time we have usually. So we take it very responsibly that we're going to put out content that we think it worth spending time on. So it's content, first of all, that we've spent time on ourselves, that we've done the reading, we've talked about it, we've thought about it to make sure that we think it's going to be valuable for people who read it. We also have a list of principles on our website, and all content has to be run through those principles to make sure that we're meeting the commitment we've made to ourselves and to our audience.
Okay, and how did you grow to 1 million monthly readers in such a short span?
I find these questions really, really difficult to answer, right? Because one of the things that happens when you look at success stories is you get this survivorship bias thing happening, right? We succeeded, so what did we do right? And were there? I'm sure there have been hundreds of other blogs who maybe started with similar starting conditions and didn't make it. So what was the difference? And so often the resulting list can be, you get the necessary but not sufficient attributes, right? So we do some things, I think, really well. I think we have a lot of respect for our audience. We really try not to waste their time, to screw it up. We have a diversity of offerings to give people multiple ways to interact with our content. And we really try to keep our content timeless so that at any point you can join our community, you can read an article that we put out 5 years ago, and it's still going to be relevant and it's still going to be useful. And I think so our approach kind of is more about principles than tactics, which is actually one of our principles that we live by. If you have time for a story, there's this great story that we actually use in our second Great Mental Models book. One of the model is ecosystem. And there was this coach in the National Football League in the United States, Bill Walsh, and he took over the San Francisco 49ers football team. And when he took them over, they were horrible. I mean, they were worse than horrible. And in 3 years, they won the championship. They won the Super Bowl. And a lot of focus at the time, and even going forward, was, he developed this brand new West Coast offense, this brand new tactic. That's what won them the Super Bowl. And so a lot of people tried to emulate the West Coast offense. And every coach who worked with him at some point, they were hired to put out the new West Coast offense. But when you read his story, when you read his books, and then people who've written about him, it wasn't the West Coast offense that won them the Super Bowls, right? It was the system that he put in place. It was a flexible, agile system that covered all components of what it takes to win. And if at any point, I have no doubt that if that West Coast offense wasn't working, he would have changed it up. He would have looked at what his system could produce, because it could produce a lot of options. A lot of tactics came from those principles. and then been able to continue having success in the league. So I think that's the approach that we take at Farnam Street. We don't worry as much about the tactics. The tactics can change. We try to make sure we have a system that will allow us to adapt and give us the flexibility to respond to, when the environment changes, which it inevitably does.
Right. And if I may ask, how many monthly readers do you have currently, and how do you monetize that content? Because a lot of blog content is free, but how do you plan to monetize it on your website?
Oh, well, we have a really fantastic learning community. And so it's a paid membership, and you can join our learning community and you get access to some exclusive content. You get access to podcast transcripts. And you also get access to this platform that involves community conversations. And we have so many community members who network in there, who learn from each other. But it's not all about transactional stuff. We have amazing, there's conversations right now on, how do you find your signal in a world full of noise? And, really respectful, interesting, deep conversations, thoughtful ones about, how do you reconcile, let's say, believing in a religion with being interested in science? And, normally outside in the world, those conversations can get really contentious and, not useful. And we've created this amazing community that's willing to explore those questions together and really learn from each other. So that's an amazing part of it. We also run events. We have our Rethink workshops on decision-making and innovation. And, those sell out. People really enjoy those. They get a lot from them, and we enjoy doing them. It's a way to connect with our audience and to get more, instant feedback on the kind of work that we're doing, the kind of information we're sharing. So we have things like that.
Got it. And, I recently read your fantastic book, which is the Great Mental Models book series, the volume 1. And, I've been part of startups, and even though I've been part of some few successful startups, I've failed in raising funds. I'm in trying to get a product market fit for some of the companies that I've worked for. Why do people, even successful ones, have blind spots when they're trying to solve problems? And what is the best way to avoid the blind spots and avoid the problems?
We all have blind spots because our perspective is inherently limited. I mean, that's just the reality. So if you think about the original terminology comes from when you're driving your car, right? So you're focused on the road, and the laws of physics and the design of the car says that, you've got these two blind spots on either side. And what you do, even though you can't look at them all the time, you train yourself to check in every once in a while. Because you know that if you remember to do that, you're going to prevent problems, you're going to prevent accidents. It's a very similar situation when we're in our lives. So professionally, you have a job to do. You have outcomes to attain. You have performance agreement standards to meet. You have things that you need to get done. And that is what determines your focus. And your focus determines your reality. So what's really important if you want to identify and possibly compensate for your blind spots is to first remember that you've got them, and everybody has them. So you shift your focus once in a while, you shift your perspective, you look at that larger scope, you go spend time with other people in the organization, see what's going on for them, see what their view's like. And then for you, deliberate learning, deliberate thinking, the mental models. I can't speak highly enough about mental models. I've noticed a change in my life, how I deal with problems, how I solve problems in advance because of the models that I now have in my repertoire. It's also really important to test your learning. It's not enough to just read a book and learn something and think you've got it. You have to get out there. You have to try it out. To be honest, you probably are going to fail a bunch of times, and that's really valuable too, as long as you take the time to reflect on your failures and learn from them. What did I do? What was my mindset going in? What are the choices that I made? Now that I know the outcome, what can I do differently? What were the flags that came up that I didn't see because they were in my blind spots? And that's kind of when you get into this lattice work, because no one model works in all situations. So when you widen your perspective, then it helps to have even more models. I think of models literally as like a lens. Like I imagine myself wearing glasses, and I have these little lenses that I can pop in that kind of give me a different view of the situation. So you use those models and you look around at what's happening and you say, okay, what am I noticing now that I've got this new perspective that I didn't notice before? And then it's super important to write it down.
Okay. So writing down and reflecting. So are you saying that somebody should keep a daily journal, or whenever somebody's trying to solve a problem, or at the end of the project, they should write down and reflect back?
Yeah, so I think it depends. I don't want to be prescriptive. I think it depends on what works for you in your life. We use a decision journal, and you can look that up on our website, the decision journal process. And I find it really useful when I'm making a big decision. So, there's a lot of transactional decisions you make in a day. You can go ahead and make those, like what you want for dinner. But if you're facing a really big decision and and you're trying to get all the information, but, even with all that information, there's so many parameters that maybe are outside of your control or that you can't get enough information on, you start that decision journal before you make the decision. So you say, here's the decision I need to make. This is the thinking that went into it, and this is what I expect to happen. And the reason you want to do that before you make the decision is you don't want hindsight bias to kick in later, right? Sometimes you make good decisions and they have bad results. And sometimes you make bad decisions and they have good results. And if you can't tell the difference between the two, you're not going to learn anything. Right? What you want to be able to say is, I made a good decision for these reasons. These are the results I got. How could they have been better? Or how could I have improved my decision-making process going in to get a better outcome? You absolutely don't want to be in the place where you're making terrible decisions and completely coasting by on luck, because that always runs out.
Got it. And in the volume 1 book, you talked about the 9 mental models. So which are the ones most people should be aware about, or and how many mental models are you going to talk about in the next following books?
So we're going to have 5 books, and those 5 books are going to cover just over 100 mental models. Right. And yeah. And I know that seems really daunting. I mean, when you first hear it, you're like, oh my gosh, I gotta learn all these 100 concepts. But what you'll find as you go through the books in general is there are certain themes that develop. For instance, the concept of bottlenecks, right? It comes up in economics, it comes up in systems, it comes up in biology. So you start to see themes, you start to see patterns and trends with these models that then are reflected in your daily life. The 9 mental models in volume 1, I love them all. I would never say, one versus the other. I do think that some are more useful for certain situations. So the best thing to do is look at the situations that you're in, read the book, and do the work to decide, okay, I can see how this model may really help me. For instance, map is not the territory, it's kind of the meta model, because models themselves are maps. And it's just this really great refrain to keep in your head all the time when somebody's giving you a report, when you're evaluating the success of a project. You can say, okay, what's the map here and what's the territory? What do I know from what's been communicated to me versus what did I experience from being involved and being on the ground level? If you're trying to improve productivity, what's the difference between the strategy that's being communicated and the reality for the worker that you're trying to improve the strategy for? And there's always a gap. So that's just a really great model to have. Another really good one is inversion, because it's super simple. And this, a lot of these also, by the way, are really useful for your personal life. Inversion is one I use with my kids all of the time. You're in that moment as a parent where somebody's having a temper tantrum or you're having a fight and you just need to get out the door, and your gut reaction is to just make it better right now. Just fix this moment to get out of it. But what inversion can do, and I should say the problem with that is you end up having those same moments over and over, right? You're fixing the immediate, but you're not fixing the future. And what inversion can do is you imagine, okay, what do I want my relationship to be with my kids to be like tomorrow or a week from now or 10 years from now? And then you put that in your brain. You're like, okay, that's what I want 10 years from now. I want us to get along. I want us to trust each other. I want us to respect each other. And then you work your way back and you say, okay, what do I need to do now? What can I do now to get to that goal? And so that's why I find inversion just incredibly useful, because you imagine where you want to be, you imagine your success, and then you work backwards and say, what do I need to do to get there?
Correct. Right. So interesting. And you talked about these mental models, but you also written in your blog that humans tend to be attracted to change and novelty. And
Yes.
what has happened with social media for millennials like me and for Gen Zs is that we are constantly bombarded by content on social media. There's a concept of FOMO. That people are doing something and everybody is happy, but that leads to a lot of irrational decisions. So how can one be rational and make rational decisions in this world of social media where we just bombarded by content everywhere?
Right. Well, for me, a great filter for social media is the signal versus noise filter. And there's a ratio in there. So how much noise do you have to sift through to find a signal? And a signal is just a communication of information that is valuable to you. So if you think about it in a physical concept, it would be like a ship crossing the ocean and they get to the coast of a new country and it's dark out and it's hard to see, but there's a lighthouse, and that lighthouse, that's the signal. I mean, that's the most important piece of information that ship needs at that time. And so when you're going through social media, what you're looking for are the signals. I think that different people have different tactics for this. People look at ratios, how much they have to sift through. People implement their own filters to try to be deliberate about what they access. I think of it as a push-pull type of thing where I don't tend to consume what is pushed at me. I tend to consume what I pull. I mean, we all have friends and relatives that we love who, document their entire lives on social media. And as much as I love them, to be quite honest, that is not useful for me in my life. So
Right.
I don't look at what's pushed at me. I'm very deliberate about who I go read, who I go follow. And I try to pull the content that I think will be most relevant for me.
Correct. Yeah, I think what has worked for me is to switch off all notifications on my phone, and that has brought some sanity to me. Otherwise, I was always looking at what new updates my friends are putting up on the social media.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. So it's not being thrown at you. Then it's up to you to make a choice in a moment to go look at what's happening.
Correct. That's how it should be. But when you talk to mental models, you've got to talk about Charlie Munger. He's got to be the broadest thinker in modern history. But Charlie talks about to have Charlie and Warren talk about circle of competence. So how do you know you have a circle of competence, and how can one operate out of one if you want to?
Yeah, circle of competence is such a fantastic model, and I think the only way you're at least started to have a circle of competence is when you can be completely honest with yourself about what you don't know. And that sounds easy, but I think it's actually really difficult for people. The more you specialize, the more you get experience, the more you try to carve out your niche about this is what I know and this is what I'm an expert in, and nobody challenged me in this territory because I own this territory. It increases your value, or at least you think it increases the perception of your value. When I first started working at Farnam Street, I thought, I'm a good writer. I mean, everybody can learn more, but I'm a good writer. And when we got our first editor, and she would send my articles back, and I mean, there were so many track changes and red ink, and the instant reaction, and I think it's really normal, is to say, oh, what do they know? I said it better. They're just being overly critical. But then I was like, wait a second. And, Shane and I talked about it, and it was like, what are we trying to get here? We're trying to get better. We're trying to expand our circle of competence. And part of that is saying, you know what? This person has a lot of knowledge that I don't. What can I learn from it? And even if it's just learning how to use a piece of punctuation better, that's still more than I knew yesterday. And so when you get to that place, I think when you really have a circle of competence, you start to get a lot more relaxed about what you don't know. Because when things come in, you can parse them a lot faster. You can say, yeah, I'm familiar with this. I understand this. Oh, hey, wait, this is new. What don't I know about this? What can I learn about this? And how you operate in one, I think one of the best ways is to solicit outside feedback. And so that was like what the editor did for me on the posts, right? You go to somebody who has knowledge and experience in what you're trying to get better in, and then you get them to watch you work or evaluate a piece of your work and give you honest feedback. And that's also how you're going to find some of your blind spots.
Interesting. What I've also read is athletes have coaches, and some of the top performers have coaches. Do you think somebody like me, or even people, listeners who are listening to this conversation, should have, a coach, or somebody whom they look up to, who can give them feedback about their work?
Absolutely. I mean, coaches they're great. And I really do think that's how a lot of people get better. And now sometimes you can't afford to go out and hire an independent professional coach, but often you may have somebody in your circle who is willing to, maybe you could be a coach for each other, right? I mean, if you're developing a circle of competence in something that they're interested in, there can be a mutually beneficial relationship there to help each other out to further those circles. But yes, coaches are, the reason why coaches are so valuable is because they're that outside perspective. They're the person who's standing outside the car saying, okay, this is what you're missing because this is what's in your blind spot. And that is just invaluable.
Interesting. And, to continue about Munger, I want to talk about the Munger operating system, because he's phenomenal in the sense he talks about getting rid of envy, working people to admire. And, so what would be the Munger operating system, if listeners would want to understand?
I think the most important thing that in relation to the models about the Munger operating system is that models are not isolated. They're a lattice work. And Charlie Munger talks about that a lot. They're a lattice work. They go together, they fit together, and they're used together. So when you think about learning the models, you can kind of think of it as a reverse funnel. You want to start with the ones that have the broadest applicability, that are kind of going to cover more situations in your life. And as you learn them, you don't just learn them in isolation, you learn them and you fit them together. Because often you'll use one and it'll open up a door, and then you'll find, oh, hey, this is another one that would be really useful to complement this. And then you work your way down to the more specialized models that may be more particularly useful in a situation that you're facing. But the Munger operating system with that lattice work is just, that's the single, I think, most important thing about the mental models approach, is that they have to be used together.
Correct. And also, I want to talk about the Feynman technique on, the best way to learn anything. And do you think anybody at whatever age, somebody into their 30s and 40s can also learn anything new? Or is it just for people into their teens who can learn something?
No, I think anybody can learn anything new. And I think it's really exciting to learn new things. I mean, to be honest with you, to write the Great Mental Models series, I have had to learn so much that I never knew. The second volume that's coming out in February is models from physics, chemistry, and biology. I haven't looked at a lot of that stuff since high school. So, and like as part of the Feynman technique, you want to be able to explain what you learn to a 5-year-old. And that's kind of your measure. Like once you can do that, you can say that you really know something. And that challenge, it's an iterative process and it's super exciting. And it's also the way to keep your brain healthy, right? It's also the way to keep engaged with your life and what's going on, is to take on and learn new things, to step out of your specialization, no matter how uncomfortable that makes you feel, and try to augment what you already know with what's out there.
Right. And do you think it would take 1,000 hours to learn something, or do you think somebody can hack their way into learning something faster? Because humans love shortcuts, but do you think I could do 1,000 interviews in a year and become a better podcaster?
I think it depends on the quality and the deliberate practice you put into that. I don't think it's just a volume thing. I think somebody could do 1,000 podcasts in a year and not get any better. But somebody could do 1,000 podcasts in a year, and with reflection and learning and a deliberate attempt at growth, then they're going to really improve over those 1,000 podcasts.
Got it. Interesting. And so, I quickly want to do the top three. What's your favorite business book?
Oh, yeah, these questions. This is great. So my favorite business book is The Goal. I know it's an old one, but I really, really like it. I find that it's super interesting because of all that it teaches you about economics, about systems, about productivity, so much interesting stuff. But one of the things I really loved about it is that it's set as a narrative. And so the guy, Alex, who you're with him as he's trying to improve his factory, you're also with him in his life, in his home, and his marriage is struggling and he's having a hard time with his kids. And I like that because to me, that really reflects how we live our problems. I mean, problems never happen in isolation. If there's problems at work, it bleeds over into the home. And so when we're trying to solve problems, we have to solve them in the greater context of our lives. And I thought the book did a really good job of portraying that.
Correct. We'll put that in the show notes. If you could go back in time when you started your career, what is the one thing you would have focused on or done anything differently in your career?
So if I could, knowing what I know now, if I went back in time to my early jobs, when I would have failures at work, and we all have them, I would tend to focus on what I learned in terms of tactics, right? So I had this job at a car dealership once that was terrible. It was a terrible fit for me. It was a terrible environment. But what I learned from it was probably, don't work at car dealerships. And that really wasn't the lesson to learn, right? The lesson to learn, there were so many more things to learn about what I needed as an employee, what kind of environment I was well suited for, what kind of contributions I could make to an organization. So I think if I could go back in time, I'd be more deliberate about extrapolating from my experiences the principles that would have guided me to make better choices.
Interesting. And do you have any favorite online tools, example, Gmail, Slack?
I do. I have a favorite online tool to share with you, and it's one called Hemingway Editor. I don't know if you've ever used it. It's great. So what you can do, what I do all the time, is I'll paste an entire article into Hemingway Editor. And what pops up are all the times I've used passive voice or all the places I've used an adverb. And it's just a really instant, talk about, shifting around and trying to improve your circle of competence. It's an instant feedback mechanism on where my writing could improve in that moment. And I find it extremely useful. I don't necessarily change everything to fit Hemingway Editor, but it just is this alternate view that kind of makes me look in a blind spot, if you will, and helps me be a better writer.
Interesting. Yeah. And I just want to know what is the best way people can get the book, which is the Great Mental Model, Volume 1.
Oh, yeah. It's you can get it on Amazon. We have an audiobook. We have a Kindle version. We have a hard copy that will be available at the beginning of December. It's just on a boat from Latvia right now. And we'll have the Great Mental Models 2 in the same formats available in the early new year.
Correct. Well, we'll put that in the show notes. And what is the best way people can reach out to you?
Where our contact information is online, but our email addresses are pretty easy to figure out. So I'm just Rhiannon at fs.blog.
Got it. I'll put that in the show notes. Thank you so much for coming onto the show and talking about mental models and the book which has come out. I really appreciate speaking to you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been really great.
Thanks for listening to the Life Self-Mastery podcast, where we teach you how to start and grow your online business. For more information, visit Rohit's blog at www.lifeselfmastery.com.